Good morning again, everyone, and thank you for being here. If anyone had trouble getting in on the bridge this morning, I'm sorry. A couple of us did, and I can only surmise that maybe the free conference bridges are being overwhelmed with the amount of church services that had to go virtual. But we're here now, and we are together. So for the last few weeks, we have been talking about obstacles along the way, the obstacles that we encounter on our spiritual journey. In the Eastern tradition, these are called the five kleshas. And last week we touched on the first one. And I say touched because I think you could probably spend a lifetime just studying each one of these. But we touched on the first one, which is sometimes called ignorance. It is called a lack of spiritual understanding. And the basic issue there that we considered is that what you and I see, what we experience through our intellect, the judgments and the decisions that the intellect makes based on the sensory input, this is not reality in terms of spiritual reality. We see things as we believe them to be. We see things as we have been conditioned to see them. And we believe in the complete reality of the physical experience as it takes place around us. So that was kind of the general summation of this first obstacle. Now I also mentioned that in the traditions of Judaism, we have the book of Genesis, we have the metaphor of the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve left the garden. They left this experience of closeness with the divine. They walked together in the cool of the evening, is the way the poets put it. And they left because they sampled the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil. Remember, it didn't say it was a real experience of good and a real experience of evil. It said it was the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil. And when they left, two cherubim were put at the gate to keep them from getting back in to the tree of life. And that's what we're all doing. That's what this journey is about. We are all trying to get to that tree of life. We're trying to get back to the garden. And the two cherubim also appear in symbolism of the Buddhists. And in that symbolism, not the tree of life, but the Buddha itself is sitting in a cave in perfect peace, perfect calm, perfect repose, sitting there in a meditative posture. And it's holding up the palm of its hand in the form of a stop sign, like you might see a crossing guard hold their hand up to stop traffic. And just outside the door of the cave are two cherubim, two ugly characters. And they are there kind of preventing people from getting into the place they want to be, into that peace, into that tranquility, into that experience of the perfect silence. And what Joseph Campbell tells us that symbolism is that the Buddha holding his hand up in the stop sign position, it means be still. Don't pay any attention to these two ugly characters outside the door. They're delusions of your mind. Come into the peace. And what the two characters represent are our fears and our desires. So what is it that keeps us from experiencing the peace and the presence and the calm that is already here? But our own fears and our own desires. As we get further into the obstacles, these things manifest themselves as grasping and aversion. We try to hold on to the things that we believe are going to give us pleasure, and we try to avoid the things that we believe are going to cause us discomfort, pain, and suffering. So what I wanted to expand on today, I've been talking to some folks throughout the week and getting some questions about what's going on in the world with this pandemic, and how do we as seekers, as people who are deliberately walking the spiritual path, what do we make of all this? How do we deal with all this, you know? Because a great deal of what we get is fear. It is just based on fear. You turn on the TV set and they they give us more things to worry about. And then part of that is that the way that medium works is they have to find an emotion to tug on in order to keep our attention, and fear does that. And of course, over the millennia, you know, people use that as a way of getting power over one another, you know. So we are faced with this situation, and it is real. You know, it's amazing to think that we are living through a significant event in history. I mean, I remember when I was a kid growing up, we read a little bit about the flu epidemic in 1918, and it was just, you know, facts in a book. We probably had to memorize certain aspects of it, you know, how many people got sick, how many people died, all those kind of things. But those people weren't real. The people in the history books weren't real. They you know, there were words in a history book, and we had to read them and we had to study. And we also read about the plagues and the Black Death and the sicknesses and things like that that swept across Europe. And again, it was a long time ago in a far away place, and it was just very, you know, very detached from what was going on. It's hard to relate to people who lived in those periods. You know, it just seems like they were somehow different than we were. They were somehow living in different conditions, living in a different world. And then here it is upon us. And now we are those people to some degree. We are the human beings who are living through that time. And we have with us right now, we have a much greater ability to communicate and to get information from all around the world than ever before. So back in 1918, people got their news through the newspapers or perhaps through newsreels in the movie theaters, you know. And it could be controlled, it could be edited, it could be slanted, and people would get to see what other people wanted them to see. Now you can get on social media or Twitter, and you can talk to your friends on the other side of the world, and you can get a first-hand account. So all I'm saying is, when we turn on the news, when we turn on these things, we can be exposed to a lot of information, much of which is frightening. And the question then comes up naturally: what do we do with that? How do we deal with that as spiritual beings? How do we remain calm in the midst of this chaos? You know, what should our attitude be towards this? Do we just ignore it? Do we just not turn on the news and say, well, that's too depressing, I'm just not going to turn that on, I'm not going to listen to anything, you know, I'm going to go and watch movies on TV and things like that. Now, there's nothing wrong with watching movies on TV and things like that. I mean, we need a break. We need an emotional break from the constant barrage of information that's coming to us. But if our intention is to escape, to avoid, to pretend that it is not there, then I would say that we need to look at that. We as spiritual beings need to look at that. What's going on with us? See, Dr. Holmes tells us that we should never be afraid to face a discordant fact in the face. We don't have to run away from the circumstances of the world. We don't have to look at these things and say, I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to pay attention to it. We should never be afraid to face a discordant fact in the face. And if we are afraid, and I'm not criticizing anyone if we are, but if we are, that is an opportunity for our spiritual growth. Right? As we get into the discussions of grasping and aversion, what is it we're trying to avoid? And perhaps what we're trying to avoid holds for us a great opportunity to grow. I know I've mentioned this to you in the past, but there was a teacher in the East, and students would come to him and he'd say, well, why are you here? Why did you come to see me? And they would say, well, we've heard you're a great guru and you can help us to reach enlightenment, and what we want is to reach enlightenment. Of course, every student everywhere says that, right? And he says, well, what is the one thing that you're most afraid I'm going to ask you to do? And they would think about it, and they would tell him, he was the guru, he was the great teacher. They had traveled far and long to get to him because they believed that he was going to help them reach enlightenment. So they answered him. And as soon as they told him what they were most afraid he was going to ask them to do, he told them, well, then go do it. Then go do it. Because sometimes that which we are avoiding holds for us our greatest opportunity for growth. You've heard me say, when we talk about the 7 main aspects of God, and use the example of Moses at the well, marrying the daughter of the priest, that for him love was the quickest approach to God, which it is for most of us. Right? Love is the quickest approach. But there's going to be one of those seven things that it's going to be the one that we're going to say, oh no, I don't know about that one. And that is the one that contains our greatest opportunity for growth. So on our journey, as we move forward on our spiritual journey, we certainly want to go to whatever is the easiest, whatever is the one that we are going to stay with the most. It's easy for us to stay with love, perhaps. And then we are going to find the one that's the most difficult, and we're going to have to find a way to approach that as well. So what I'm suggesting here is that as spiritual beings, as we look around us, we are looking at the outpicturing of race consciousness. This is what the human race collectively believes in and believes is necessary. And we shouldn't be afraid to look that discordant fact in the face. This is where human consciousness is. People are afraid. There is pain. There is suffering. We don't have to pretend it's not there. We don't have to look the other way as if I don't want to get caught up in that. But we can look at it as an observer, not without empathy for those who are suffering. But we can look at it and understand, as Dr. Holmes tells us, never be afraid to look a discordant fact in the face, because we know it is not real. We know it is not real. And then we would say, but it is real. But I turned on the news and it is real. And the numbers are going up and people are getting sick and people are dying. And yes, those things are happening, but that is not the spiritual reality of who and what we are. Remember, the first obstacle is this lack of spiritual understanding. We don't see things as they are, which in Buddhism we're told, that's kind of the goal, if you will, is to see things as they are. We don't see things as they are. We see things as we believe them to be. So the race consciousness believes in the necessity of disease. It believes in the power of matter over spirit. And yet, when we go into our spiritual teachings, we learn exactly the opposite. Matter doesn't create consciousness. Consciousness creates matter. Matter does not control or exhibit dominion over spirit, but it is spirit that is superior to matter. So what that represents to us then is we hear those words, and they're kind of, well, that all sounds good, but, and we have to stop and say to ourselves, So the reason that the race consciousness is caught up in this is a belief in materialism And I don't have to be caught up in that belief in materialism. I can see it, I can understand it, I can feel empathy and compassion. I can do everything I can to be kind and loving to those who are suffering. But if I get into the mode of fear, if I get into the mode of worry, if I get into the mode of suffering with them, I am not helping a bit. I am part of the problem. I am part of the problem. So the first thing we look at is say, well, do I just stick my head in the sand, walk away, and say I'm not going to pay any attention to this? No, we don't do that. There's no need to do that because we're not afraid to look a discordant fact in the face. And in fact, in so doing, we could be missing important information that would help us to protect ourselves and to protect our loved ones, to keep from passing this thing around from one to the other. Because race consciousness is strong and race consciousness believes in the necessity of it. So then that brings us to the next kind of thing we look at and say, well, if I do my spiritual practice, if I do my treatment, remember Dr. Holmes told us that the purpose of treatment was to insulate, isolate, and inoculate ourselves from race consciousness. If I do my treatment, if I insulate, isolate, and inoculate myself from race consciousness, then I should be able to walk unafraid amidst, all of the disease, all the chaos, and all those other things and be fine. And the answer to that is, yes, you should. Yes, you should. We should be able to walk on water. We should be able to raise the dead. We should be able to do all those things because we've been told that all of those things we could do as well. But at some point we have to ask ourselves, am I there yet? Am I there yet? Dr. Holmes, Emmett Fox, other teachers all tell us that there's a danger with trying to go past our current level of understanding, right? And what that means sometimes is we get ahead of ourselves. Instead of understanding exactly where we are on the spiritual path, we want to consider that we are at the end of the spiritual path, that we have completely transformed, transcended our human consciousness, and we are living completely in the divine consciousness, which is immune to the activities of the flesh. And Emmett Fox, I think, gives us the clearest example of that. He says, if you're walking down the street and you find someone who has been injured and they're bleeding profusely, certainly before you do anything, you stop and you bring your mind to the image and the perfection of God and God's perfect activity, and know that there is no such thing as injury or bleeding or death in the mind of God. He says, but then if you look down, there's still bleeding. You better put the tourniquet on. You better put the tourniquet on. You have to do what is appropriate for your level of consciousness at that time. So sometimes things like this happen and people will say, well, I should be able to just ignore the health warnings and go out and move about my daily business and do all those things and be fine. And the answer to that is yes, you should. But if you were really there in consciousness, the thought to do that would never occur to you. It would never occur to you. See? Lori and I were taking classes with a professor of Hindu philosophy. What a remarkable man. Dr. Chubb was his name. He taught at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And surely, I don't think he can be with us anymore because I think he was like 92 when we studied with him in the early 90s. And he said, if you truly love your wife, if you truly love your husband, it doesn't occur to you to say, gee, I wonder if I love them. It couldn't occur to you. If the question occurs to you, then the answer is no. The answer is no. Right? Because total, complete love could not question, would not question. So this isn't this isn't sort of a test where we are to go out and try to see where our consciousness has evolved. Because in order, in order for us to think that we need to test ourselves, it means that we're not ready for the test. We are not ready for the test. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't do our treatment. It doesn't mean that we don't believe that through the practice of spiritual mind treatment, through the practice of meditation, through all of our tools in our spiritual toolbox, that we cannot bring ourselves to a place in consciousness, in biblical terms, where no harm shall become thee, 1,000 fall at thy right, 10,000 at thy left. Doesn't mean that we don't believe that, but it means that we also treat and move our feet. We do the practical things. And here's another way of looking at that. We may be able to go out and travel in the midst of all of this and remain healthy, but does that mean we won't pass it on? We won't pass it on. And so people are passing this disease along who have no symptoms whatsoever. And you don't want to be one of those. You don't want to be one of those. So we treat, we move our feet. We treat, we do the practical things. If you're looking for a job, you do your treatment and you send out your resumes. But you still expect that the action of that treatment is going to lead you to the right place at the right time. We treat to know that in the midst of the chaos, we are centered in peace. We treat to know that in the midst of disease, that the intelligence that created our bodies knows how to maintain them in perfect health. But we still do the practical things of washing our hands and keeping our distance and being careful for our loved ones, I mean, I'm sure you've seen the reports this week of the invincible young people down on the beach for spring break. They just well, not going to get me. I don't. I'm not worried about it. It's not going to get me. And the question is, well, what about the people you're going to pass it on to? That wasn't their concern. They were wrapped up in the moment of they were young and they didn't want to miss their spring break, and I can understand that. So we don't ignore, we don't pretend it's not there, and we don't not do the practical things. But the thing that we do first, if you go back to the example of Emmett Fox, is you start in a place of consciousness. You start in a place of stopping to ask yourself, what do I know as the spiritual truth in this situation? So we do that. We go through that. We say, well, what is it that we know about God? Is God, the other question that comes up for people is God sending this to us as a punishment? Is God sending this to us as a test? Why does God allow these things to happen to us if God loves us and all those things? We just have to stop and take a deep breath, because it brings us back to the very essence of, what do I believe? What do I believe? Divine love has created each and every one of us out of itself. We are its living expression here. We are in this condition, this human condition, if you want to call it that. We are having this experience in time and space. We are having this experience in these mortal bodies. We are having all of this because it is necessary for our development of our uniqueness as we make our journey on the spiritual path. But none of this defines us, and none of this defines God. That which is always becoming. There is always endings. There is always chaos, and then there is a new beginning. Always, always, always. And until we step into the realization that we are spiritual beings and that we are the only ones who can control our consciousness, and that ultimately our consciousness controls the experience we have in life, until we step into that and begin to practice that and learn how to practice it effectively and efficiently, we kind of roll along with that tide. So we watch the TV, and the TV says, you know, it's cold and flu season, and we expect so many people to get sick this year, and all those things. And if we don't separate ourselves from the herd in our consciousness, we are buying into that. We are accepting into that. And what this is an opportunity for us to take a deep breath and take a step back and say, yeah, that's what's going on in the world of appearances, you know. And things like this have gone on in the past in the world of appearances. All kinds of things have taken place in the world of appearances. But none of those define who we are as spiritual beings. And we want to remain identified with the spiritual identity. When nuclear bombs were first used in the Second World War, someone said to Dr. Holmes, you know, now we have the complete and total power to destroy life on Earth as we know it. All humankind. We can destroy it all. We've got power to do that. I don't know, they used to give us statistics, you know, 10 times over, 100 times over, however big the nuclear arsenals were. And they said to him, you know, is that a possibility? Could that happen? He said, sure, it could happen. You know, race consciousness can do lots of things. It's possible that we could get ourselves into a nuclear war and everybody start releasing all the weapons that they had, and we could, in fact, destroy all of life on Earth. We had the power to do that. And we didn't have the emotional maturity not to do that. And they said to him, well, aren't you concerned? You know, how does this fit into your worldview that God is good and life is good? And he said, well, he says, if mankind, through its own ignorance, completely destroyed itself here on this planet, he said, life itself would find another way to express. We might find ourselves on different planets, in different bodies. We might find ourselves evolving in new forms on what's left of the planet. He says, but we have to understand that life itself, the principle of life itself, is not limited by or defined by this human experience. So this brings us back then to our spiritual understanding. If our understanding is one of the complete reality of this physical experience, and that is the only experience we have, then it's easy to see how we can get caught up in fear. But if we understand that all of this is transient and changing anyway, then we can proceed without fear. We can go into our spiritual practice, and we can invoke the prayers of divine protection. There's some beautiful ones in Scripture. The 91st Psalm, you know, He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide in the shadow of the Almighty. Or he who abides in the secret place of the Most High shall dwell, not sure which. What that's telling us is start first by uniting our consciousness with God. Start first by remembering who and what we are spiritually. And we don't just kind of pass through in a cursory move and do that for a few minutes in the morning and then turn on the news and go into fright. We have to stay there. We have to abide there. We have to dwell there. Right? We can't let ourselves be pulled one way or the other. The other one, the beautiful one, is the 23rd Psalm. You know, the Lord shepherds me; I lack nothing. He leads me to the green pasture beside the still waters. I mean, you have to get that image in the desert environment where this poem comes to us. You know, the water might be stagnant, or the water might be too swift, but these waters were the still waters. They were moving gently. They were pure. The grass wasn't just grass, you know. It was the lush pastures, the green pastures. So we have to do what we can in our spiritual practice to bring ourselves back into this feeling of oneness, this feeling of unification, this feeling of protection, and this feeling of love. So one of the 5 kleshas, the one that we're gonna talk about as we go through in the next week, we're going to certainly talk about them more. We're going to talk about grasping. We're going to talk about aversion. We're going to talk about a lot about fear. And the big one, the big fear that dominates our society is the fear of death. It's kind of the root of our other fears. So if we understood spiritually, if we understood that there is no such thing as death, yes, there's change, yes, there's transition, I was thinking of this morning. My God, when our children were born, we were in the hospital, and this sweet little creature comes into this world, just everything about it was a miracle. Everything about it was so wonderful. There's kind and loving hands here waiting to greet us when we come in. People thrilled to see us when we got here. We took delight at every little thing about the baby, as the people in the hospital cleaned it up and wrapped it in the swaddling clothes, and it was just so wonderful, And it never occurred to us, in that moment, it never occurred to us to ask, well, where did that little soul just come from? And I wonder if there are people over on that other dimension, on that other side, who miss it. Just popped into my head this morning. Never occurred to me, never thought of it. We're so caught up in the joy. And I think that can make it easier for us when we look at the subject of death. Because as the soul throws off this moral coil, as it leaves this human body, and as a group of people here are sad, to see it go, are there people in the next plane who are delighted to see it arrive? I don't mean to make light of death or grieving. When I would officiate funerals, I would often say, if you look in the New Testament, if you look at the story of Lazarus, it gives us an interesting take, because according to the story, Jesus knew that Lazarus was sick, knew that Lazarus was going to die, and let that happen so that he could teach a lesson. That's me paraphrasing what's in that story. You can go read it for yourself. And when he got to the tomb to call Lazarus forth, he met his friends, Martha and Mary. And Martha and Mary were distraught. Their brother had just died. And of course, this is a teaching parable, and they're saying to him, well, why did you let this happen? Same way today, we say, well, God, why are you letting this happen? Why did you let this happen? And he said, well, I had to let it happen. I think the terms were so that God could be glorified or something like that. To make a point, I had to demonstrate something. And he began to cry with them. He began to cry with them. Now, isn't that interesting? He was the very Christ. He had the awareness of the presence of God within him. He understood that this thing that we call death was nothing more than a change. He told Martha and Mary, don't worry, he's not dead, he's only asleep. He understood that. He knew he was going to call him forth from the grave in just a few minutes. And he stood there and he cried. Why did he cry? And I believe it is because of compassion. I believe that he felt the suffering of his friends so much that he was overwhelmed by it. I don't know this, of course nobody can prove this. I'm just telling you what I make of the story. Even though it's not real, it hurts. And he was caught up in the sadness of his friends. So I'm not saying that we should make light and we should be glib. It hurts, it's sad, it's painful, people are suffering, but it is not permanent. It is not real. So all of these things that I'm talking about, all I'm trying to say is, if you find yourself as you're watching the news, as you're talking with other people, and are saying, well, what should we do? What should we do? How should we act about this? Should we avoid the news? You know, well, certainly you got to take breaks from the news. Certainly there's some important information that you're going to have to get from the news. Do your spiritual practice, do your mind treatment, do your meditation to go within and find that place of peace, and act out of that guidance, you know. Treat and move your feet. Do the things that seem appropriate and necessary, you know. Avoid contact. Wash your hands. Do all the things that folks are being told so you can stop the spread of that. But what we want to consider is that wherever there is fear, there is an absence of love or a restriction of love. Right? He who knows fear knows not God. God is perfect love. Those sorts of things. Perfect love casts out fear. So when we are looking at the fear, and Dr. Holmes tells us that fear is a contagion. Fear is like a germ. You know, you remember the story we read as children about Chicken Little and the sky is falling? Fear is contagious. One person gets afraid and another person picks up on their vibe, and another person picks up on their vibe, and before you know it, everybody's into a state of panic and worry. It is a contagion. It is a germ, and it spreads much like a disease. But what is that disease? It is an absence of love. It is a restriction of love. So what can we do in this situation? We can be love. We can be love. Lori and I were out at the Asilomar conference one year, and I wish I could remember the minister's name. She was from up in Canada somewhere, on the west coast of Canada. And she was relating a story about how her daughter, who lived in California, was about to give birth to her first grandchild. And she went down to California to be with her daughter, and she went into the labor and delivery room to be with her daughter. And she said the labor and delivery nurse did not like grandmas being in the room. She said the labor and delivery nurse just kept making little digs, little remarks. Oh, yeah, Grandma? Yeah, Grandma? Sure, Grandma. You know, just really sticking it to her. And she started to become so agitated at the way that she perceived this nurse was treating her. And she says she wanted to blurt out, "Darn it, I'm a spiritual leader." And at that moment, the absurdity of what was going on in her consciousness became apparent to her. Her ego was so wrapped up, you know, so involved. And she said, being a spiritual leader in a labor and delivery room really didn't have a whole lot of value. You know, they needed doctors, they needed nurses, they needed people who knew how to do delivery, they needed people who knew how to take care of the baby. And they were all there. See, they were all there. But somebody who could teach a lesson, somebody who could lead a prayer, it wasn't so important at that moment. And she said, but she realized that what she could be was love. She could be love because her spiritual teaching was that love is all there is. And she found a way to stop bickering with the nurse and to be love. She treated in her own consciousness to know that her daughter was a child of God, that her grandchild is a child of God, that the labor and delivery nurse is a perfect instrument of God's love and of God's healing, that every hand that cared for her daughter is the loving, perfect hand of God. And as she changed her consciousness, this is the way she related the story to the group at Asilomar. As she changed her consciousness, the situation around her changed. The bickering became less. The bickering went away. As the child was born, the nurse handed it to Grandma. Things like that. People are afraid. People are afraid. But we don't have to be one of those people who are afraid. We can go about our lives. We can do the things that we ought to do in order to protect ourselves and one another. But not out of fear, not out of fear. We don't wash our hands out of fear. We wash our hands out of love. We love those around us so much that we take every precaution not to make them ill. This is love. We can be kind and loving to one another no matter what the circumstances. If you have never read it, now is a great time to get a copy of and read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He found a way to be kind, to be loving, to be compassionate, and to be happy in a concentration camp, knowing full well that he and everyone around him was very likely to go to the gas chambers. He said if it happened, it happened. But no one could take away his right to be happy. He found ways to inspire and to encourage and to uplift his fellow prisoners, even in the midst of death all around them. And you and I can be that light as well. You and I can be that inspiration as well. You know, we are socially distancing, but we don't have to be isolated. We've got video chat rooms, we've got social media, we've got telephones, we've got things that they didn't have in 1918. And we can get on there and we can be love to someone who could use a little bit of love. So rather than be afraid, rather than be caught up in all of the drama, I invite each and every one of us this week, find a gift to give. Find something to share. Find a way to do something that is uplifting to another person. Send them a note. Just tell them that you're here. Tell them that you love them. Lose the ego needs the minister talked about. You know, get our ego out of the way. Stop thinking about what we're not getting. Stop thinking about what we can't do because we're isolated. Stop thinking about all of those things and find a way to center with love and share it. And share it. Out of the Silmar, there was a musician named Suze, S-U-Z-E, Suze. And I'm sure people who have been to various conferences know her. She just had a guitar and she would go around and she would lead people in songs. Delightful soul. She said she was in the saloon business for 20 years and then she got into the church business. And she said it was just a different kind of spirit, just a different kind of spirit. But she had a little song that she would sing, you know. And I can hear it. I wish I could play it for you. I can't do that over the internet. We'd be violating copyrights. But it was just take a little love and pass it on. You know, take a little love and pass it on. And before you know it, the world will start to show it. Take a little love and pass it on. So in this time of chaos, the calm is already with us. It is already within us. It is already here. It is unafraid. It is love. It is compassion. Please start your day with a time of spiritual practice to unite with that. And then go throughout the day and find ways to share that. God is love, always has been, always will be, is here with us in the midst of this chaos, and we are here to be its instruments. Dr. Holmes tells us that fear is like a germ, and it is contagious, and it spreads. But love also spreads, and it is twice as powerful as fear. Tap into that power. Open your hearts to God's love. Certainly declare that everything that is going on around us is not necessary. It can change. It will change. There can be medical discoveries. There can be ways of flattening the curve. And while race consciousness is working through all that, we can be love. We can surround ourselves with love. We can surround those we love with love. We can surround the doctors and the nurses and the healthcare workers with love. We can surround the patients with love and their families with love. And we can be God's instrument of love. It is times like this that reveal to us what we truly believe. These are opportunities for us to observe ourselves as we react and respond. Dr. Holmes says if we're afraid of anything, the first step is to admit it. And then to analyze why we're afraid. And then to eliminate those reasons by uniting with love. All of our fear comes from a belief in separation. Love is the dissolution of the belief in separation. Be love. Be love for yourselves, be love for each other, be love for the world. Because that is what the world needs now. And so it is. Now this morning, I actually found, I know I've told many about this book, Living the Science of Mind by Ernest Holmes. It is really the only book that he's ever written to kind of expand on and explain specifically the science of mind teaching. This was an addition. These are his essays that were in addition to the home study course, which was his first year course. And this is a treatment that Dr. Holmes wrote about fear. Please join me. I lay all fear aside, and in confidence and complete faith, I turn to the one perfect divine presence. Knowing that the light of truth shines upon my path, even as divine love guides me into the secret place of the Most High, where I dwell under the shadow of the Almighty. I know that there is nothing to be afraid of in God's world. Fear cannot operate in me, nor can it go forth from me. At the very center of my being, there is a complete confidence, complete faith. At the very center of my being, there is a consciousness of the protection of divine love, the guidance of divine wisdom, and the strength of divine power. And so I turn in thought to the whole world and know that my word is bringing light and life and a feeling of strength and confidence to everyone. I turn in thought to the leaders of the world everywhere and know that love and intelligent guidance is directing their thoughts and actions. I turn in thought to all of the nations of the earth and awaken in them the realization that there is good enough to go around, that there is a divine government under which they all may be protected from the fear of each other. I turn in thought to the great creative imagination of the human race and assure it that there is a feeling and a presence at the center of everything waiting to make itself known. And I turn to the great God who knows all things and who can do all things, and I say, lead kindly light amid the encircling gloom. Lead thou me on. And so it is. All right, everyone.